Καλησπέρα. Σας καλωσορίζουμε στις φετινές διαλέξεις του Ινστιτούτου Συλλαγών Σπουδών. Αυτό το πρόγραμμα πολύ σύντομα ελπίζουμε. Ξεκινάμε με έναν εκλεκτό καλεσμένο, τον καθηγητή Stefan Berger. I'm going to introduce you to our audience. I will say very good. Ο Stefan Berger είναι καθηγητής στο Bochum, καθηγητής κοινωνικής ιστορίας στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Ruhr και διευθυντής του Ινστιτούτου Κοινωνικών Κινημάτων. Έκανε την βίδου στην Οξφόρδη, δίδαξε στην Αγγλία για 20 χρόνια, στο Κάρντιφ και στο Μάντσεστερ, ευρωπαϊκή ιστορία, επέστρεψε στη Γερμανία το 2011 και είναι πολυγραφότατος. Η διατριβή του αφορούσε τη σχέση, μια σύγκριση μεταξύ του Γερμανικού Σοσιαλδημοκρατικού Κόμματος και του Βρετανικού Εργατικού Κόμματος στα αρχές του 20ου αιώνα. Διατηρεί ένα σταθερό ενδιαφέρον για την ιστορία του εργατικού κινήματος, του σοσιαλισμού, των κοινωνικών κινημάτων. Άλλωστε είναι και εκδότης του περιοδικού Moving the Social, το οποίο ασχολείται με την ιστορία των κοινωνικών κινημάτων κυρίως. Και στο οποίο έδωσε μια πιο διεθνοποιημένη κατεύθυνση, έστειλε στα γερμανικά, τώρα δημοσιεύσει στα αγγλικά, τα άρθρα κλπ. Ένα δεύτερο πεδίο ερευνών του αποτελεί η εθνική ταυτότητα, ο εθνικισμός, το οποίο στην πορεία του συνέδεσε με την ιστορία της ιστοριογραφίας. Έχει γράψει λοιπόν μια σειρά από μελέτες για το έθνος και την ιστορία, την αφήγηση του έθνους, την εθνικοποίηση του παρελθόντος, καθώς και συγκρίσεις ανάμεσα στις διαφορετικές εθνικές ιστορίες της Ευρώπης και όχι μόνο. Και το όλο ενδιαφέρον για την θεωρία και την ιστοριογραφία βγαίνει και στο ότι είναι από τους προέδρους του δικτύου για την θεωρία στα συνέδρια κοινωνικής ιστορίας που οργανώνει το Ινστιτούτο του Άμστερνταμ κάθε 2 χρόνια. Λοιπόν, το τελευταίο βιβλίο που επιμελήθηκε μαζί με την Αλεξάνδρα Πρεζιρέμπελ, δύσκολο να το πούμε, αλλά λοιπόν, λέγεται Moral History of Capitalism και αφορά μεταξύ άλλων την ηθική κριτική που ασχέτει από ποικίλια κοινωνικά κινήματα στον καπιταλισμό. Εμπίπτει απόλυτα σε ενδιαφέροντα ενός ερευνητικού προγράμματος που διεξάγεται εδώ στο Ινστιτούτο με θέμα ηθική και οικονομία, στα πλαίσια του οποίου έγινε και η πρόσκληση του καθηγητή Μπέργκερ. Και από το βιβλίο αυτό προκύπτει και το αντικείμενο της ομιλίας του απόψε με θέμα μια ηθική ιστορία του καπιταλισμού. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Nikos, for what I'm sure was a very nice introduction, and many thanks to the Institute for inviting me here, and special thanks to Nikos again for organizing all of this. It's been great to travel to Crete to give a lecture, but maybe I'm already so much in holiday mood that this will show during the lecture, but we shall see. Do we need a new moral history of capitalism is the title of the talk. Yes. And what I'm going to say is pretty much based on a couple of things I've done together with Alexandra Tschirembel, as Nikos already mentioned. An article we published together in Historische Anthropologie in German on Moral, Kapitalismus und soziale Bewegung, and then the book that Nikos mentioned on moralizing capitalism that just came out earlier this year. Now, what I want to do this evening is first of all talk a little bit about the trajectories of the writing of histories of capitalism, how it developed over time, and pay special emphasis on the importance of crises for the critiques of capitalism, which have also structured much of the writing about capitalism. And I would like to relate this also to what, I guess following sort of Jürgen Habermas, can be called the colonization of life worlds by capitalism. And from there, from this kind of colonization of life worlds, I will move to E.P. Thompson's concept of the moral economy in trying to understand cultural aspects of capitalism and talk a little bit towards the end about those cultural aspects, in particular questions of morality, moral sentiments, also notions of capitalist morality, and the moral critique of capitalism before arriving at some tentative conclusions. And I hope that I can do all this in round about 40 minutes. If we start with the trajectories of the writing of histories of capitalism, this person you see here on the right is usually credited with writing, well, not about capitalism, because he didn't use the word capitalism or the concept of capitalism yet, but nevertheless Adam Smith described the beginnings of what subsequently has often been described as capitalism, and he also delivered a moral defense of capitalism, because he argued that trade was a natural urge of humans, and to trade in always already existing markets belonged to humanity. It was the most efficient and the most humane ways of organizing the economy because it was in line with human nature. And in fact, following Smith, most 18th century defenders of capitalism thought of it as being morally far more superior to what they saw as the amoral system of destructive passions that it thought to replace. So the kind of feudal order that capitalism thought to destroy. Albert Hirschman, in his book from 1977, quite an old book, The Passions and the Interests, has shown this very well. Then I think we come to these two gentlemen, because the concept of capitalism from the 19th century has been closely aligned to dialectical and historical materialism espoused by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, although of course the term itself was also not used by Marx and Engels. The noun capitalism does not appear in Capital and in the writings, in the sort of writings of Karl Marx. The coin is often, the term is often credited to Louis Blanc, who used it in 1850, and then Karl von Rothbertus in the German lands used it quite extensively in his writings from the 1860s. So the term capitalism emerges out of a critique of economic practices that did not develop under the label capitalism. So the system, there was no system called capitalism. Those who were capitalists did not say that they worked a system called capitalism, but the concept of capitalism emerged out of a critique of particular practices of economics. But what these practices were and what they have been ever since is actually also something that is quite unclear, which makes the concept of capitalism so opaque until today. I think we can probably say that it has something to do with exploitation, with alienation inherent in capitalist modes of production. It has something to do with private property, with accumulation, with markets, and with competition. But how these things relate to each other in order to produce something that we call capitalism, I think up until today remains highly contested, and I will come back to that later on in my lecture. Marx and Engels, of course, famously saw themselves as scientists. They claimed that they had found a scientific method of explaining and critiquing capitalism, and they were famous for their polemics against those who, in their eyes, were not scientific and who only delivered moral condemnations of capitalisms. They attacked, of course, particularly the utopian socialists, which they called utopian socialists, which went before them, but also, and this is from the Communist Manifesto of 1848, quote, they attacked philanthropists, humanitarians, improvers of the condition of the working class, organizers of charity, members of societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals, temperance fanatic, hole and corner reformers of every imaginable kind. So those were the kind of moralists that Marx and Engels said they had nothing to do with, because they had found a way of basing a critique of capitalism on science. And their critique of capitalism was a revolutionary critique of capitalism, predicting a proletarian revolution that would end capitalism because capitalism was producing the conditions for its own downfalls. That's all part of their historical and material, their historical and dialectical materialism. However, very soon there were also those calling themselves Marxists, like Eduard Bernstein, pictured here, who in a way developed a reformist critique of Marxism. Bernstein always maintained that he was a Marxist, but he did not no longer see it necessary to call for a revolution, because he argued that circumstances had changed and it was now possible to end capitalism and move to socialism via parliamentary democracy. We know that he had been deeply influenced by his experience in exile in Britain, great friend of many people in the Fabian Society and also in the Independent Labour Party. And the idea basically was that you control the markets through states, that tax policies would also have a role to play to move to a more just society. But you also did have a number of people who were not Marxists at all, who were also very much critiquing capitalism. So you had a strong reformist social liberal tradition, in a way wanting to move to a capitalism with a human face, making capitalism socially responsible. This was particularly strong amongst the so-called new liberals in Britain in the late 19th and early 20th century. Michael Frieden, in his book Liberalism Divided, has written about that, a concern for social equality that was combined with classical liberal concerns for freedom. But it was not just in Britain that you had this reformist liberal tradition, the Verein für Sozialpolitik in Germany, or the progressive movement in the US echoed those liberal sentiments. And of course you have also a non-Marxist, reformist, social Catholic tradition that debated whether capitalism needed to be transformed or whether it could be reformed. But certainly we have in Catholic social teaching also a powerful critique of capitalism. And the critiques of capitalism were not restricted to the left. We also have on the right critiques of capitalism, conservative right-wing critiques of capitalism, moving back to the 19th century. In the German lands, for example, Ada Müller, who critiqued capitalism especially for destroying the organic family unit in society, and argued for a return to a form of Ständestaat, of an estates-based society. We here also on the right often have a connection of anti-capitalism with anti-Semitism. Even Werner Sombart, who's not easily categorized as being on the right. After all, Sombart also famously called for a fusion of socialism and capitalism. But Sombart, in his famous booklet, identified capitalism very much with Jewish Geist, so strongly anti-Semitic thinking. The conservative revolution in Germany after 1918 and literary figures like Ernst Jünger provided a fundamental critique of industrial society that they often linked to capitalism. Now, we do have then various critiques of capitalism, Marxist and non-Marxist, emerging out of the 19th century. Again, the concept of capitalism is established as a critique of economic practices, rather than a form of self-description. The study of the concept of capitalism and its various meanings made a major leap forward in some respects only started in earnest with the publication of Werner Sombart's book on capitalism, Der moderne Kapitalismus, Modern Capitalism, first published in German in 1902. And he already connected very strongly capitalism with the emergence of modernity. I think I had Sombart, this is Sombart. And this guy, Josef Schumpeter, writing in the 1930s, was, if you like, another important step in the historiographies of capitalism, writing in the 1930s, yes, again, under the impact of a major economic crisis. He argued that capitalism had been imbued with moral values in the 19th century, but at the time of his writing in the 1930s, quote, all moral beliefs have gone out of capitalist life, end of quote. So, like Sombart, following in the wake of Marx and Engels, he perceived of capitalism above all as an economic system, and we can see that through this trajectory from Marx and Engels to Sombart to Schumpeter, the historiographies of Marxism are very strongly emphasizing capitalism as an economic system, and this, I would argue, this continues very much until today. Schumpeter's Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy from 1943 praised the historic achievements of capitalism, celebrated what it called the creative destruction unleashed by capitalism, but also predicted that this would be the reason for its eventual downfall. And that's another characteristics of the historiographies of capitalism, because they very much emerge out of a critique of capitalism rather than a justification of capitalism. They very often ended in predictions of the downfall of capitalism. However, we also have, especially from the 1940s onwards, more optimistic theories of modernization that are connected in particular with American social science, Torkel Parsons, which equated capitalism with development and rationality. And especially during the Cold War, those modernization theories and historians of capitalism working within the remit of modernization theory very much followed these more optimistic ideas. And they could feel justified in 1989, 1990, when with the downfall of communism, it appeared that liberal capitalism had finally triumphed over communism, and Francis Fukuyama's book of 1992 symbolized that particular mood in the early 1990s, a triumphalist capitalism standing victorious and ending history, if we are to follow Fukuyama's thought of the early 1990s. And it really then took until the 2000s for more critical perspectives to move back to the fore. Peter Hall and David Soskic in 2001, in their famous book Varieties of Capitalism, brought back the idea that in fact when we're talking about capitalism, we're talking about multiple and changing systems, both over time and space. And they drew attention again to the fact that capitalism as a concept had something highly abstract, highly aggregated. And this sort of train of thought of the concept of capitalism being problematic actually led the American political sociologist Fred Bloch in an article in Political Power and Social Theory from 2012 to ask the question, should we still be using the concept of capitalism? Because he argued that if it was so abstract and so highly aggregated, maybe it was not the best way of understanding what was going on in different parts of the world at different times with economic systems, and he was still very much about economic systems. So we have many conflicting definitions of this highly aggregate term, and the German social historian Jürgen Kocker, in his short history of capitalism from 2016, has been, I would argue, perhaps one of the most lucid in trying to cut through the thicket of various descriptions, and he came up with a very simple definition of capitalism, characterized by three characteristics. First, individualized rights to property. Secondly, coordination of economic actors through markets and prices. And thirdly, the use of capital for the production of goods and services. And that use of capital always involved an element of risk and insecurity. And in that lies, he argues, the dynamics of capitalism. But basically, I think this long trajectory of the historiographies of capitalism showed that it was, right from the beginning until today, what the philosopher of science W.B. Galli called in 1955 an essentially contested concept. Many historians have argued that we need to look at trade and commodity chains for the development of capitalism. Kenneth Pomeranz and Stephen Topic's book, The World That Trade Created, from 2017, made that argument. We have also had a lot of attention on how the critiques of capitalism accompanied capitalism from its beginnings. Luc Boltanski and Yves Chapello's book, Le Nouvel Esprit de Capitalisme, from 2001, made that argument. And again, Jürgen Kocker, in his short history of capitalism, argued that in fact it was precisely the fact that capitalism drew strength from that critique by adapting in the light of critique. So for Kocker, the long-term resilience of capitalism lay in its ability to correct itself. So the major strength of capitalism was an ability to auto-correct. Now, if we look at the trajectories of those historiographies of capitalism, here I come to my second point. I think we see how important recurring crises of capitalism were for those historiographies. In the wake of the last massive crisis, after 2007, 2008, we had a rush of books dealing with capitalism. David Graeber's Debt, 2011, Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century of 2013, and Adam Tooze's Crashed, How a Decade of Financial Crisis Changed the World of last year. Just some examples of a massive outpouring of histories of capitalism after 2007. And we see similar outpourings of histories of capitalism each time there is a major crisis. We see it in the 1890s when we have 1880s, 1890s, big depression in Europe. We see it with the Great Depression of the 1920s and early 1930s. We see it with the reconstruction of Europe after the end of the Second World War. We see it with the challenge of the New Left from the mid-1950s to the early 1970s. And it only seemed to sort of subside with this triumph of capitalism in the 1990s, but again, the new crisis of 2007 already brought back a new outpouring of books on the history of capitalism. And in fact, we can see that each of these crises was connected with the prediction of the end of capitalism, and we see the same after 2007. Many books were written again about capitalism predicting its end. One of perhaps the more famous ones was Emanuel Wallerstein's book that he co-wrote with several others, Does Capitalism Have a Future? of 2013, where he also adds to the long line of people who predict the downfall of capitalism. The justification of capitalism often ascribed to the moral underpinnings of capitalism. I refer to Adam Smith and the economists of the 18th century at the beginning, and the critics of capitalism who wrote in the wake of those economic crises also often denied precisely this point and accused capitalism of immorality. The accusation was not just based on the fact that the system wasn't working economically, but it was also always based on the point that it was amoral. Hence, I think we need to move beyond a mere economic understanding of capitalism, and I think that this has also already started. If we look at Nancy Fraser's call in the New Left Review from 2014, where she calls for an expanded concept of capitalism, moving beyond the mere economic understanding of capitalism. If we look at economic historians such as Jakob Vogel and Hartmut Berghoff in Germany, who in their book Wirtschaftsgeschichte als Kulturgeschichte from 2015 argued for a cultural history of capitalism. If we look at Christoph de Jong's book, Die Fäden des globalen Marktes of 2013, where he follows a cultural history of world economic trade through one German global trading company. If we look at books that seek to understand capitalism through consumption, such as Jan de Vries's The Industrial Revolution of 2008, if we look at books that seek to understand capitalism through histories of what has become known as the fiscal military state, such as Per Friese's book on state, economy and the Great Divergence, or even if we look at anti-capitalism and the history of anti-capitalisms, such as struggles for democracy at the factory or in the community, struggles for better access to education, struggle for women's rights. So we see that both the histories of capitalism and the histories of anti-capitalisms have been moving beyond a mere concern for the economic towards other spheres of life, and I think that is connected to the fact that capitalism as a system was never a merely economic system, but has always been able to colonize life worlds that were outside of the economic sphere, so that the struggle of capitalism was also taking place not just in the economic sphere. If we look at that colonization of life worlds by capitalism, then we can go back to the early analysis of capitalism, such as Sombart and Schumpeter, who already in some respects argued that in fact we can identify capitalism as the beginning of the modern society, that modernity was deeply connected, the emergence of modernity was deeply connected to the emergence of capitalism. They, however, then went on to analyze capitalism largely as an economic system, forgetting that this colonization of life worlds also had an impact on other spheres of life, on social and cultural and political spheres. The importance of war and violence for the breakthrough to capitalist practices has recently been emphasized by Sven Beckert's book, Empire of Cotton. Studying actors, discourses, practices, and knowledge production cannot be reduced to studying the economic sphere alone, but many of those spheres were interconnected with other non-economic spheres. Jens Beckert's recent book, Imagined Futures, argues that capitalism is best understood as what he calls a system of expectations, and he highlights the ability of capitalism to open up horizons of a better future time and again from its beginnings until today. Similarly, the German historian Thomas Welskop in the journal Mittelweg in 2017 argued that the key characteristic of capitalism has always been its future orientation, that it managed to imagine better futures, and these imaginings of better futures, again, were never simply based on economic rationalities, but were always also based on cultural values, on cultural imaginings of political and social orders. And this brings me then to E.P. Thompson's concept of the moral economy, well known, of course, rooted in his famous 1971 article in Past and Present, The Moral Economy of the English Crowd in the 18th Century, where Thompson argued that uprisings in the 18th century were not so much caused by economic deprivation, but what he called, quote, traditional views of social norms and obligations, of the proper economic functions of several parties within the community, which, taken together, can be said to constitute the moral economy of the poor, end of quote. And he connected that moral economy of the poor very much to the beginnings of capitalism and to early forms of class struggle. It was an amazingly successful concept. It meandered through the humanities and social sciences since the early 1970s. Just some of those meanderings. Craig Loon, already in his book The Question of Class Struggle of 1982, takes this concept of Thompson and also analyzes protests since the 1790s. He, in some respects, similar to Thompson, argued that these derived from ideas about collective rights and freedoms, i.e. he in a way confirms that there was something like a moral economy, but out of that moral economy, Kloon argues, emerges a form of popular radicalism, which he calls populism, a form of popular radicalism in the communities, struggling against a variety of things that are connected to capitalist practices, such as struggles to end the degradation of craft work, struggles to stop the advances of machine work, and generally struggles against the advancing market forces. However, where he fundamentally disagreed with Thompson was that he argued none of that was a sign that these people, these popular radicals or these populists criticized capitalism, or that they had any form of class consciousness. That, he argued, was in the imaginings of the Marxist Thompson. Instead, he said, we simply have forms of populism here at work in the late 18th century. Other scholars, such as the anthropologist William Reddy in The Rise of Market Culture of 1987, also used the concept of moral economy, and he defined it, quote, as a set of values and moral standards that were violated by technical and commercial changes. So a very broad definition of moral economy. Didier Fassin, in an article he wrote in the journal Annales in 2009, understood moral economy as the production of moral feelings, emotions and values, norms and obligations, and their impact on social relations. So again, very broad understanding, broadly leaning on Thompson. Ute Frevert, one of the international champions of the history of emotions approach, also uses Thompson's concept of moral economy, for example, in her 2012 book, Emotions in History. So, moral economy, I think, has been one of the most successful concepts, although it has been put to very different uses by different authors since it was first, if you like, invented by Thompson in the early 1970s. In fact, the idea to explain social change with the category of morality goes back a long way to Emile Durkheim, who in his book The Division of Labor in Society, first published in French in 1893, already pointed to forms of moral economy. And if we look at the history of social movements, we can also see that they frequently refer to morality and to forms of moral economy. Alexandra Chirembel, in an article she published in a book that I co-edited with my colleague Holger Nehring on social movements in global perspective, penned an article on the importance of moral movements in the history of social movements, movements such as the anti-slavery movement or the human rights movement. So moral economies were emerging as anti-capitalist protest everywhere where capitalism was emerging and driving out older forms of production and of social organization. This is something that Wolfgang Knöbel, the head of the Institute for Social Research in Hamburg, has recently argued in a yet unpublished paper. So it was capitalism producing winners and losers that also produced moral economies. Now, I have already, in the course of this paper, frequently stressed the synapses of capitalism with questions of morality. And if we look at those moral sentiments in the history of capitalism, we first of all see that the system of capitalism, through the system of the slave trade, was, right from the beginning, also deeply interconnected. Joseph Inikori, in his book Africans and the Industrial Revolution in England of 2016, has argued that the slave trade, with its opening up of export markets, with trade, with the provision of cheap raw materials, was vitally important for giving Britain the competitive advantage in being or in becoming the first industrial nation. And under moral pressure from the abolition movement, then capitalism found new ways of aligning capitalism to the concept of free labor, although capitalism had demonstrated before that free labor was not something that capitalism needed. It was also perfectly happy to operate with unfree labor. Early socialists, Christian socialists, artisan socialists such as Wilhelm Weitling, French socialists such as Charles Fourier, or British ones such as Robert Owen, stressed in their writings the moral degradation of this free labor which was caused by capitalism. And Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who in some respects despised those early socialists for their moral critique of capitalism, also put strong moral overtones in their own work. Capitalism, Marx argued, was alienating humans from their natural state as social beings, degraded humans through alienated labor, prevented them from fulfilling their full potential as human beings. And in fact, the proletariat, in Marx's writing, was given the task of liberating not just the proletariat, but liberating all humanity. Moral human values are depraved by capitalism. We look at Rodney Pfeffer's analysis of Marxism, morality, and the social question. I think he has provided plenty of evidence of how moral Marx was in his own writings, and was these images like these, capitalists, factories employing child labor, which were also underpinning Marx's critique of capitalism, and of course also that of Engels. Engels's book, The Condition of the Working Classes in England, first published in 1845, was written out of moral outrage for the factory conditions in Manchester. The factory work seemed to Engels to summarize the suffering of workers under capitalism. Again, division of labor, alienation, dequalification, poor wages, and on this, the development of theories of labor, of the value of labor. Engels argued that socialism would amount to, quote, a truly human morality, very much in line with Marx thinking. And in fact, especially with Engels, we could also say that his critique of capitalism was a kind of moral revulsion against the world of his father, a successful capitalist in Wuppertal in Germany, a strongly religious man who also was very much a symbol of the connection of early capitalism to morality. And Engels's revulsion against that system, I would argue, was also deeply connected to moral sentiments. If we follow the Marxist tradition, we can see how this emphasis on morality continues. Karl Kautsky, in his Ethics and the Materialist Conception of History, argues, quote, the rising classes acquire a moral ideal which becomes bolder and bolder as they gain in strength. The boldness of the new moral ideal will be accompanied by increasing enthusiasm for it. Again, it's a moral argument that Kautsky advances here. The communists followed that line of reasoning. Lenin, who of course was in close contact with Kautsky, as Maura Donald has shown in her book on Kautsky and Lenin, Lenin also argued that communist morality was the precondition for any higher development of humankind. And I mean, particularly ironic perhaps, the first head of the Cheka, Felix Dzerzhinsky, wrote a pamphlet entitled Communist Morality. But on the other side of the divide, Bernstein also very much espoused a kind of neo-Kantian moral imperative and saw this neo-Kantian moral imperative at the heart of socialism. Gramsci developed the idea of Marxism as a moral science, powered by the will to overcome an immoral present. The Austro-Marxists, such as Otto Bauer, stressed that ethical concerns were vital in strengthening socialism politically. And Georg Lukács also aimed for what he called a communist morality, and he basically saw this communist morality as being rooted in the freedom of the individual from alienation and oppression. Silvio Pons, in his book The Global Revolution of 2014, has argued that communist third worldisms after the end of the Second World War relied in their support very much on a moral dimension. At the same time, ironically, as attacks on the moral bankruptcy of communism as really existing socialism, i.e. where communism actually was in power, had become a standard critique of communism. The politics of the moral condemnation of the new left, for example, over the Vietnam War, and of the Marxism new social movements of the 1970s, the women's movement, the peace movement, the environmental movement, were all rooted in such moral understandings. And of course, on the other side, if we look at the defenders of capitalism, we also see the importance of moral arguments. Max Weber, whose whole oeuvre was one long response to Karl Marx, Max Weber, of course, argued that Protestant ethical imperatives opposed the worst aspects of what he called adventure capitalism. So it was the universal moral imperative of capitalism that, according to Weber, characterized the system. So his anti-Marxist conceptualization of capitalism was one that was entirely in harmony with those 18th century economic thinkers like Adam Smith. And defenders of capitalism would build on this idea of capitalism as a moral order really pretty much until the present. The German economic historian Werner Plumpe has just published a history of capitalism where he also argues very much along those lines. So we have a long-standing debate on merchant and industrial capitalism upholding moral standards in the economic activities that go back deep into the 19th century. But we also find non-Marxists who very much argue with moral sentiments in their critiques of capitalism. The Christian socialist Richard Tawney, in his book Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, argued that capitalism was an immoral system that had emerged under the guise of Christianity, reflecting the famous Weber thesis here of capitalism being born out of the spirit of Protestantism. And Tawney went on to argue that it was ultimately incompatible with the values of Christianity. The human rights-based critiques of practices of multinational corporations from the 1970s onwards were all based on moral critiques. The fair trade movement moralized capitalism, consumerism, and the critique of consumerism was one way of doing that. Another way was, a very powerful way, was the boycott movement, where the power of consumers was used against capitalism. So the logics of the market, if you like, were used for anti-capitalist rhetoric and practices. We have here, as Nico Steer has argued the moralization and politicization of markets operating against markets, or rather operating for a different envisioning of markets, including anti-capitalist ones. Within this kind of non-Marxist tradition of arguing against capitalism with morality, we also have Karl Polanyi's notion of an embedded capitalism, which, according to Polanyi, was based on an ethical, moral understanding of the world that assumes that human beings take responsibility for other human beings for the well-being of humanity. And this feeds into the communitarian tradition of the 1980s and 1990s. Amitai Ozioni's book, The Moral Dimension Towards a New Economy of 1988, is based on the idea of a new economy governed by moral consideration at the end of a decade, thriving on neoliberal greed. Last year, Arthur Meltzer and Stephen Kautz published a book with the title Are Markets Moral?, where again this notion of morality of capitalism is absolutely central. So, by way of conclusion, I would say that there is a very strong link between capitalism and morality that so far and to date has only been a kind of subterranean interest in the histories of capitalism. Therefore, I would argue we do need a new moral history of capitalism that would offer a productive framework for discussing the symbiotic relationship between the critics of capitalism and their adversaries, involving at least 7 different subfields of historical writing. In the history of knowledge, where, for example, histories of statistics and consumption would be very useful in discussing questions of morality also. In the histories of political culture, where the whole issue of the relationship between capitalism and democracy, I think, needs to be discussed, taking into account this kind of moral dimension of capitalism. We look, for example, at Charles Tilly's book, Democracy of 2007, where I think he describes how, on the one hand, capitalism thrived on the dissolution of forms or clusters of inequality that were associated with feudalism. On the other hand, though, at the same time, capitalism created new economic disparities and new injustices, which is exactly this kind of point of capitalism starting as a moral system and then being critiqued for not following its own moral standards. Histories of the agents of capitalism, such as bankers, stock market speculators, would be important. Histories of capitalist scandals, stock market scandals, for example, would be important. We also, I think, need to revisit the anti-capitalist protest cultures from the labor movements to the new social movements and beyond. More attention to the public sphere and the role of the public spheres would be important also in discussing social inequality, transparency and fairness. I think the egalitarian ambitions of civil society have been or have become a powerful critique of capitalism's anti-egalitarian tendencies. I've already referred to Ute Frevert and the history of emotions. That would be, I think, a 6th field in which such attention on morality would be important. And finally, the very wide field of cultural history, where moral indignation, I think, played an important role in the artistic and cultural engagement with capitalism in literature, film, and theatre. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank Professor Berger for this very rich presentation. We invite your questions, comments.
fully agree that capitalism is a contested concept, at least for many of social scientists. But I was wondering, is morality an uncontested concept? I mean, when we say we're looking for a moral history of capitalism, what do we mean by moral? Because, for instance, in France, I think in the 19th century, science morale is mostly politics, law, wherever you have a choice. So, is it a political history of capitalism based on certain value systems? So, how would you deal with this ambiguity?
Yeah, absolutely right. I think my own idea would be to opt for a radical historicization of concepts of both capitalism and morality, because I think only by situating concepts within their development over time and space, and of course we have in conceptual history also the methodological arsenal to do that, will we be able to understand both the continuities and discontinuities of conceptual meanings over time and space, and especially the various problems with translation of concepts from different or two different languages. So in that sense, you're absolutely right. I think we could also say that morality belongs to those essentially contested concepts that Galli identified back in the 1950s. So the only thing we can do, I think, is to radically historicize them, and there I would contradict political sociologists such as Bloch, who would rather abandon them, because I think abandoning them is not in a way achieving more or clearer or easier forms of definition. I think we have to live with those essentially contested concepts, and I think if we're looking, we find a lot of them. A lot of the kind of key concepts of modernity are essentially contested concepts.
Yes, thank you very much. I think one of the arguments you made is that capitalism is not just an economic system, but it's also a moral system. And I think you're absolutely right about that, as you saw. And I think there's a second argument, which is that critics of capitalism have very often relied on moral arguments, even those like Marx, which in theory created a whole system, in actual criticism of moralized critics of capitalism. And I think you're absolutely right about that as well, as again, very nice. But there's a third argument, which is that we can have a moral version of capitalism, a capitalism with human face, which I think is much more debatable, and to be perfectly honest, largely impossible. Do you see a connection between these three arguments? And if so, what is the connection?
Well, yes, I mean, you're right. I think one of them, the main argument of this paper is essentially that if we look at the trajectories of the histories of capitalism, they are, by and large, understanding capitalism as an economic system. And historians such as Jürgen Kocker, for example, have been extremely critical of extending the understandings of capitalism beyond the economic sphere, because it would basically explode his very simple definition of capitalism, which is very useful if you want to understand basics about capitalism. So I think if we accept that capitalism colonized all life worlds in the 19th century, then it was not just an economic system, but it was a system that ruled virtually all aspects of modernity. Now, then I think within the literature on criticism of capitalism, we do have essentially schools that argued that capitalism needed to be transformed, because it was something inherently immoral in the system. And we also have strong traditions which argued that capitalism could be reformed. So a kind of recognition that as an economic system, it had something incredibly dynamic. You know, the kind of this sort of the fascination with the destructive potential, which nevertheless drove societies forward, that we often find in histories of capitalism. Sombart, Weber, Schumpeter, they all were fascinated by this, but they also all saw that there was a problem with that creative, with this destructive potential. So the search for capitalism with a human face is something that almost accompanies the emergence of capitalism, and has been an ongoing project. Historically speaking, I would argue that under very specific conditions of the Cold War, and under conditions which in a way were very favorable to the industrialized world, it looked as though it was possible to create a capitalism with a human face, roughly in the period between the 1950s and the 1980s in the kind of global West. Gösta Esping Andersen's book, sort of about politics against markets, the idea that there was something like macroeconomic steering, which would allow capitalist economies to work for the good of the greatest number of people, was certainly something that was at the heart of the social democratic project in the post-war period. And I don't know whether, I mean, you seem to be saying, well, you know, you've lost that kind of confidence that this is possible. I guess it's a political question. And you will find different political answers in that. But if we look at it purely from a kind of analytical, scholarly perspective, I do think that we do have these two different trajectories: reformist and revolutionary. Perhaps not a very satisfactory answer.
Yes, you talked about proletariat, about the working class, and about capitalism. I mean, does capitalism have a face? Where are the capitalists? The businessmen. Are all businessmen immoral? They are capitalists, so that capitalism is immoral? Or are big capitalists immoral and the small capitalists moral? And I think there is no discussion. Being theoretical is very important. But we do know that the economy of today is run by companies. So I think also discussion maybe between business historians and capitalism would be quite fruitful.
Absolutely, yes, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, in my list of 7 topics, under 3, I included key agents of capitalism. So we do need to look again at those key agents of capitalism. But again, I would argue understanding the key agents by inserting more of a moral dimension into the analysis. I think business history has also often been too often about the economic performance of managers, of bankers, so it is arguing within a particular horizon of expectation that is an economic one. And I would argue that we need to extend that, and that our understanding of those economic actors needs to include more cultural factors, needs to include a better understanding of why these people acted the way they acted. And I think invariably we will find that it is not, perhaps not even primarily, an economic rationale that drives them, but it is often a moral imperative. I mean, that's certainly true for Engels's father in Wuppertal, and I would argue, I mean, if I talk to a lot of managers today, we still find behind their actions often a strong moral imperative. So I do think that, you know, if we do create a new moral history of capitalism, paying attention to the agents of capitalism, to those who present the human face of capitalism to the outside world, I think will be very important.
Let me ask you two questions. The first one is if we define capitalism non-strictly or not merely economic terms, I wonder how can we distinguish it from modernity? And well, maybe this could lead to a more economic definition of modernity. This could be this is one. The second is you presented a long tradition of thinkers discussing the relationship between capitalism and morality. And I don't know if it was a matter of emphasis in your discussion, your lecture. It generally seems that it was the anti-capitalist intellectuals and thinkers who stressed this, I mean, that the moral element was more strongly present in the anti-capitalist critique than it has been in the tradition of people who argue in favor of capitalism. I wonder if this is true and if there is, to say, different structure in the arguments in favor of or against capitalism. So if this moral element is more present in the opposite of capitalism.
Yeah, very good questions. I think the first one indeed is a difficult one because that is also something that in my many discussions with Jürgen Kocher, he always ends up with him saying, well, if you want to extend capitalism beyond the economic sphere, how do you define it? And I'm always sort of left with a rather weak position of saying, well, I refuse to define it because it is characterized by having these fuzzy borders. And this fuzziness is an essential characteristic of capitalism. So the attempt to define it will already restrict it. So in that sense, I think we need to live with those fuzzy borders, even if it means that it is hard to pin it down. Because I think the fuzziness of those borders will allow us to explore how capitalism conquered different life worlds at different places and different times in a kind of empirical way through historical research and in that way provide a richer tableau of what capitalism consisted of at particular moments in time. An answer that will always, I think, displease sociologists. But usually I found that anthropologists like it. So I think we're also probably faced with different disciplinary traditions here. The second question, I think it is probably true that in the paper I emphasize more the tradition of anti-capitalist critique, which has to do with the fact that capitalism as a concept emerges out of the anti-capitalist critique. It is not a term used as self-description. No capitalist ever called himself a capitalist. And what I wanted to show is that anti-capitalist critique, even where it masqueraded itself as being economistic, scientific, was at heart a moral critique. But I also, I think, wanted to show that the moral argument, the notion of a moral economy, was also there in those who defended capitalism. That's, why I referenced Adam Smith, Max Weber, Tucker Parsons, that this whole tradition of people who saw in capitalism, at worst, a system that was better than any other systems. I guess that's also Popper's position today. So I think that makes the call for a new moral history of capitalism all the more stronger, because you find this morality not only in the critics of capitalism, but also in those who have, if you like, stood up for capitalism. It is also not. It doesn't seem to be an exclusively economic system they are for, but they imbue that economic system with moral value.
I have the feeling that the discourse of the defenders of capitalism, perhaps nowadays, the main the key components are probably the defended in terms of progress, of rationality, of bringing development and growth, and perhaps a more technocratic discourse somehow, while the discourse of the opponents of capitalism focuses on the evils that capitalism causes to the people and society. So in this, maybe the moral element is stronger in the anti-capitalist.
Well, perhaps it is stronger, but I would say it's not. We look at today's, famous cases of venture capitalists. I guess we could look at someone like George Soros in the United States, or we could also look at major managers in industries such as the steel industry, who have been arguing for, very strongly arguing for developing procedures that would make steel producing CO2 neutral. So the notion that you can combine capitalism with technologies that would actually help save the planet in a kind of moral imperative to do so. I think you still have very strongly amongst the faces of capitalism a moral imperative and the belief that you can combine capitalism with that moral imperative.
Other questions? It's late, check out Twitter, and